The following is a presentation of unidentified entertainment and 22nd century radio. Manassas, Fairfax, Washington, D.C.
Exopolitics and ufology, religion and science, time and space. Hosted by Mike Smith.
I'm in the process of going to get fuel for my gas.
Find us on the internet, timeandspace.us. And don't forget, download our free smartphone app.
Do you look in the sky a lot?
Find us on the internet, timeandspace.us, and Time and Space Radio Show on Facebook.
Do you look in the sky a lot?
You're listening to Time and Space on 22nd Century Radio.
The Chinese have a space program now. It's not like the U.S. space program, because in the Chinese space program, Tang is one of the astronauts.
We sort of diverged, but I'll ask you a couple of questions about that. The show is called timeandspace.us. We just sort of run with it as a brand name now. I'm Mike Smith, and I'm sitting here with author Mack Maloney. And Mack, it's great to finally get to meet you and actually have a chance to interview you. Mack is an author, has been writing books for years now, right? Maybe 20, 25 years
about
at least?
20 years, yeah.
Yeah. And the one that caught my attention was UFOs in Wartime. What They Didn't Want You to Know. It was published by Penguin, came out in December of 2011. You can get it on Amazon, download it to your Kindle, a variety of other sources. And you've got another book coming out, which I'd like to talk to you about in just a couple of minutes. Just some of the notes from the the coast-to-coast bio. I sort of bounce around to some of these different sources. What are you doing? Some of these different sources and try to pick up this information. You're from Boston, right?
Mm-hmm.
And flew down here from? Or you said, oh, you took the train. Yeah, right.
Not a really good flyer.
Right. How long of a train ride? 12 hours?
It seemed
10
like 12,
hours?
but it was about 6 or 7.
Yeah. Have you ever taken the Acela back and
Yes,
forth?
I have. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That's pretty nice to...
Yeah, I didn't do the Acela this time because the times didn't work out, but I'm taking Acela from now on.
Yeah. And do you just get off at BWI? Is there a train station over there? Yeah, that's pretty decent.
Yeah.
We're up here for the Mysteries of Space and Sky conference, the 2012 edition. I actually made it out to this conference a couple of years ago and have met and interviewed Rob and Susan Swiatek a couple of times and look forward to getting a chance to do so again. It says in this bio that your father was a veteran of World War II, and he used to read military books all the time, so that probably had a big influence on you,
right?
As you picked it up too.
Yeah, he had a lot of military books around the house. He was in the South Pacific for all 4 years of World War II.
Wow.
And had a ship blown out from underneath him. He never spoke about what it was like in the war very much, but he definitely got interested in military history, and we just had lots of books around the house. And as a kid, I would just pick them up and really, at first, just look at the pictures. And then started reading them.
Right.
And that got me interested in military history.
Sure.
And, at the same time, I was also a big fan of UFOs. I loved any kind of science fiction movie that had UFOs in it. I read every UFO book I could get at a library, all the Donald Keyhole books, and and then so at one point, those two interests just kind of crossed paths.
Yeah.
I was at lunch with my editor, and we were just throwing around ideas, and I had mentioned to him that it seemed to me that that people saw UFOs more in wartime than in peacetime, and he wondered why that would be, and we kicked around. We were thinking, well, maybe because there's airplanes, more people in the sky, more people looking up in the sky. And so he says, why don't you, do a proposal, go through the whole kind of process of getting a book done, and that's what we did, and it came out in December. So I just consider myself lucky that, as I say, those two interests of mine kind of merged.
Sure. Now, it says here also that you have a graduate degree in filmmaking. You received a bachelor's in journalism, and you were into sports reporting for a little while. What were you covering as far as?
I covered the Boston Red Sox and the Boston Celtics.
No kidding. Wow. Are you a hockey fan also?
Oh, yeah. Bruins,
yeah, of course. So he's sitting here wearing a Red Sox shirt. That's great.
Well, I was going to cover this up after.
No, not at all.
Yeah, I was going to put two little black pieces of tape over it.
That's great. I'd ask you about the Bruins, but there's not much to talk about as far as...
They'll be back soon.
Yeah, sure. Well, I hope so. And then it says you left eventually and joined General Electric as a publicist. Was that really just basic publicist type work, or anything specialized as far as your?
Not really. We were we ran a department that we were the corporate PR arm of General Electric, and I did some interesting things. I don't know if this is really going back in ancient history, but at the time. There was a ban on selling equipment to Russia. Russia was building a pipeline across, and Reagan put a ban on it because he didn't like the way the Soviets were acting at the time. So for some reason that fell on me. So what I would do is probably once a week have to give out a pre-prepared denial of why we could not talk about the Siberian gas line, gas turbine prohibition by Ronald Reagan. We got into just a few. It wasn't never anything controversial.
Sure.
But we were the PR guys for their corporate office.
And how long did you keep doing that?
I was there for about 4 or 5 years, and then what they did was they disbanded the in-house office and then gave us the business. So one morning we woke up, we were the 40th largest PR firm in the country.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, they just gave us all the business. And then I just wasn't cut out for it, and I stayed there for about another 2 years. I was a part owner, and I kind of cashed out when I was writing books while I was working at GE.
Yeah.
I would get up at 4 in the morning and write till 7, go to work, and then come home and eat dinner, and then write from 5 to 10 or so. And I did that for quite a while. And looking back on that, it was a lot of fun. It seemed like a lot of work at the time, but it was a lot of fun.
Oh, sure.
I was doing this series called Wingman, which was
I was going to start in on some of those and ask you about it.
Kind of like a Mad Max and a jet airplane type series. People loved it. It was a hit right off the bat. And I was able to kind of accumulate enough book contracts to actually leave my real job and write full time, and I've been doing it ever since.
Right. So. And you've got a couple other series, Pirate Hunters and Superhawks. Are they all separate trees from each other?
Pirate Hunters is one that's out now, or actually the third book came out last year, and it's about special ops, ex-special ops guys going out, and they form a private company to battle the Somali pirates, and kind of a current thing. Superhawks was a series that we did about 6 or 7 years ago, right after 9/11. A publisher asked me if I had any ideas they were looking for books, in the post 9/11 world, let's say. So I came up with this idea of once again, kind of a renegade band of U.S. special ops guys who become terrorists themselves, and they do terrorist acts against the Muslim fundamentalists. And a lot of people liked it. I got lots of letters from people who lost people in 9/11.
Yeah.
It really kind of touched a nerve with them. I think that it got a little bit too hot for the publisher, so they only did 4 books.
Oh.
But, then you just go on to other
things.
Yeah,
sure.
But, I really like doing the
Wow,
Superhawks.
That's great. So, and that's a long time to be writing fiction. So, did you consider that a big transition to come over into the nonfiction world? I mean, your whole writing style and the way you approach it has to be completely different.
Well, I thought it was going to be easier, and it turned out to be about 5 times harder.
No kidding.
Yeah, it really did. I really thought it was going to be easier, and then once I got into it, and I realized all the research you had to do, just keeping track of all the sources, interviews, determining what stories to use. There's 70 stories in the book, and I think we started out with about 200. We had a pair of them now.
Wow.
And we just took the ones that seemed most interested and that sounded good in the chronological order. So Well, excuse me.
Sure.
But it did, yeah. It took me probably 3 times longer than I thought it was.
No
I kept
kidding.
missing the deadlines. And,
Right.
wow. So
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was. I remember halfway through, and I just looking around my room, and it was just the open books everywhere, notes. It was a mess, and I thought, what have I got myself into?
Right. This is timeandspace.us. We're talking to author Mack Maloney. He's the author of UFOs in Wartime, What They Didn't Want You to Know. Who else maybe was involved in the process of helping you pare it down to 70 stories?
Well, the editor had a little bit of input, but he would just say to me, "Well, you are now the quote-unquote expert on this." But he understood, as what because we really didn't have a basis for what the book was how the book was gonna go, which is kind of funny because you think that you would, but it was really kind of open-ended, Find out why UFOs seem to show up more in wartime than peacetime. That was really it. And so then I figured, well, how are we going to do it? And I just thought chronologically would be the best way to show it, and mostly in the 20th century. I would just gather lots and lots of information. I relied a lot on another very famous UFO writer, Jerry Clark.
Yeah?
Who really helped me a lot. And I would call him up every once in a while just to, I would tell him, and I still tell him, I said, I call you when I have to be brought down to earth here, because there's just so much craziness out there. He's someone who's a really grounded person. He helped me a lot. And just, I was able also to, just reading the other books that other people had done, like Robert Hastings had did that book on UFOs and nukes, and that's just like, I consider that the Bible on that subject. And so whether they knew whether they were helping me or not, I don't know, but they were helping me.
Right.
And then the final, what I would do is I would write a whole bunch, and I would make my wife sit there and listen to me read it, which is the worst thing, really, that a writer can do to their wives.
Right.
But, and she would say, yeah, that one sounds good, and, I think she actually said they all sounded good. But, so that was...
That's great.
Yeah, that was my panel of advisors.
So, in the course of doing that work, I can only imagine some of the sources that you had to go to. Some of the more mundane, we could sit and go through them, but what was maybe the most exciting or most interesting source that you had to go dig up in the course of doing that book? We hear about visits to the National Archives and all these libraries, and of course there's a lot of legwork and groundwork.
Right. But well, what was funny about it too is that we agreed on the contract, and then, as I said, when I got in the middle of the day and thinking, wow, what have I done here? I went out to breakfast with my editor, and I said to him, is this the kind of book that you want an index? And he said, no, it's not the type of book you need an index. And I said, wow, that's great. Because I didn't want to do an index, frankly, because I know that they... And, but as it turned out, I wished I had. Because, we kind of jumped from source to source, did a bunch of interviews, but, they're here, there, and everywhere. And if you read the book, you see that, I kind of go overboard in citing these sources because they were just so valuable to me. If we had done an index, I could have just taken care of it that way. And footnotes. They didn't want any footnotes.
Wow.
Jerry Clark was probably the #1 guy that helped me a lot. There's a gentleman named Dr. Richard Haynes, who wrote a book on UFOs over Korea. He's currently working on one in UFOs over Vietnam. Ex-NASA engineer, helped design the Gemini space capsule. Very interesting guy. I had 2 phone conversations with him. I could have talked to him for hours. He was really very, very interesting guy. Those 2 really helped me a lot. Keith Chester, who wrote a book on Foo Fighters called Strange Company. I was on the phone with him constantly, and he wrote the foreword to the book. He was very helpful. I know a few people who actually work for government intelligence agencies who steered me in the right direction a couple times, uncredited. And then the rest of it was just, really me sitting there reading a lot.
Right. It had to be.
Yeah,
so let's talk about the chronology then that you do cover in the book. Now, the part that was very interesting to me was the end where you get into the Gulf War, and I'll ask you a couple questions about that in a minute, but I think that there's this misconception from what I've been doing a lot of interviews and research myself in the past 3 years or so, and the one thing that I feel like I've seen, I've tried to stay in that little gray area between experts like yourself and the general public. And in that little gray area, there seems to be this misconception that Roswell is the end-all and be-all. It's the beginning of the storyline.
Mm-hmm.
And that has persisted, and people still stick to that. They hear the Kenneth Arnold story, Roswell. You had a lot of material from prior to 40, the Battle of Los Angeles has now gotten to be a big event. How far back were you intending to go, and how good are some of the sources you found for that material?
Well, I didn't know how far back I was going to go. I started in the 20th century because I only began there, like with right around World War I, because I had in my head that the reason people were seeing UFOs during wartime or right before wartime was that we had airplanes. Mm-hmm. And people are up there flying around, had more opportunity to see, and people are on the ground looking up more often because now there are things flying over their head. And so I actually started in 1909 with the scare ships of Great Britain.
Right.
And then we go right from there to 1914 to World War I, and then on up to the Gulf War. And then when we did that, I remember thinking, but there's got to be more. And I just remember, you hear like the Eric von Däniken books, which I read, as a kid too, and you always hear that there were biblical visions that might have been UFOs and stuff like that. And I said to my editor, I said, listen, I think we got to put a run-up chapter in this, and I'm just going to go back and pick some interesting stories, some almost ancient history, just to kind of get everyone's appetite ready for what we're going to do. So he said, okay. So we actually went back to 300 BC, which was a story that Ralph Edwards, who was a radio broadcaster back in the 50s, had his own radio show. I love old-time radio, and I just barely remember this guy. But he had also written a few books on UFOs, or he wrote essays on them. And he had the story about Alexander the Great, who was about to cross this strategic river during one of his wars to take over the known world. And he had a large army, he had a large cavalry, and he had war elephants. And these 5 flaming shields come out of the sky and start buzzing his army, spooked the horses and the elephants to the point where they wouldn't cross the river. And I said, that's a great one to start with. Why not?
Absolutely.
So we went from there, and then we tell the story about Constantine the First, which is a story that I didn't realize so many people knew about. But basically, what happened was, now we're in 300 A.D. Constantine is about to do battle with one of his rivals, and whoever wins is going to be the next emperor of Rome. The night before the battle, they see, or the day before the battle, they see what can only be described as a UFO in the sky, and it's cross-shaped. And Constantine takes this to mean as a sign, and he orders all his troops to draw a crucifix or a cross on their shields. He thinks that this is a sign from God saying that if all my troops put crosses on their shields, we're going to win this battle, even though they're the underdogs. Well, they do win the Battle of the Mernavin Bridge. And he becomes the next emperor of Rome. And the first thing he does is he makes Christianity the official religion of Rome. And there's a case that can be made that and then, of course, it's spread out now. It's the largest religion, I think.
Sure.
There's a good case to be made that, the reason that Christianity is so widespread today is from a UFO sighting. When I came upon that, I said, I had never heard that story before, and that's gold, you know what I mean? Especially for starting a book.
Absolutely.
So then we just went from there. We went to the Black Death during the bubonic plague. People started seeing, and I found out that all kinds of strange things were happening during the Black Plague. There were nights where the sky was as bright as day. Strange animals washed up on the beaches of France.
Mm-hmm.
All this weird stuff was going on. And amongst the weird stuff, people were seeing these guys in black, dressed all in black with scythes, and they were destroying crops and killing animals, while people were dropping dead all around them of the bubonic plague. And we kind of draw a dotted line to the fact that maybe what we call these people now, the Grim Reapers, but they might have been the first men in black.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a story in there about how Columbus, the night before he found land, he saw, lights in the sky and so on. So just stuff like that, just to kind of get everyone's interest going. And then we got to the real stuff, which, as I said, we started with the scare ships. So
right.
that was the reasoning. And it took me maybe about 3 or 4 minutes to tell you that, but it took about 2 or 3 months to figure it out.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely.
It just if it sounds easy, that means it was hard to come up.
Right. Now, in the course, I'll leave a lot of it in the book, and highly recommend the book. I was glad to get a copy from you, of course, but I already put it on my Kindle and had shot through it months ago. It's called UFOs in Wartime: What They Didn't Want You to Know. It's by Mack Maloney on Penguin Books. You can find it at Amazon.com. You go through a lot of stuff in World War I as well as World War II. Mm-hmm. I'd like to just briefly touch on the Korean Peninsula sightings and the Vietnam sightings. A lot of this, I think, was new material for the UFO community. There wasn't a lot of documentation on those sightings. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. And I agree with you. I think a lot of people think that the whole kind of UFO phenomenon started with Kenneth Arnold, Roswell, but you go back to World War II, there were Foo Fighters, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Foo Fighters seen during World War II. Not just over the European theater, which a lot of people have that misconception, but just as many over the Pacific theater. And thanks to Keith Chester, because he's the guy who really he's the guy who went to the National Archives and looked for the stuff, And then before that, a fascinating case, I think, the Ghost Flyers of Scandinavia of 1931. Yes. Where these strange airplanes just showed up over this very isolated part of Sweden, for Boston, I can't even pronounce it, way up near the Arctic Circle. People started seeing these very weird airplanes. They were huge, 8 engines, pontoons, twin boom tail, flying around with huge searchlights underneath them. They would fly around towns for hours, 6, 7, 8 hours, just circling a town. And you can't even do that now without having to land and refuel.
Of course, right.
They would follow railroad lines. They would circle mountains. They would do all this stuff, crazy stuff that no one could ever really figure out.
Startling detail, really. I mean, just the stuff that you've just said.
Yeah, and no one has ever figured out exactly what was going on. The only theory that some people came up with was that this was that they were German airplanes, and this was 1933, so it's 6 years before the war started. And the Nazis were in control of Germany, but people say, well, they had a secret aircraft carrier up in the Arctic Circle and so on. But first of all, these type of planes, they had pontoons on them, so they weren't being launched from an aircraft carrier. Mm-hmm. Number 2, the Germans never had an aircraft carrier. Number 3, even if they had some kind of a ship that was able to launch these things, there was at least a couple dozen of these airplanes spotted on any given night. It wasn't just one. Mm-hmm. So to have an airplane back in 1933, when airplanes were still fairly rare, flying up near the Arctic Circle in those kind of conditions, cold, at night, you would need a huge support base for that. Okay, you'd be hard pressed to do that today with an aircraft carrier. Where were these things landing? Where were they getting the fuel? Who was flying them? Why are they flying around with searchlights on them? It wasn't the Germans, and then they just suddenly went away, and no one ever came forward years later or ever and said, I was one of the Ghost Flyers. This is what we're doing. They just simply vanished.
Right.
And no one knows, what happened to them. That's just a crazy story. It's not really UFOs in a way. It's not this shape. It's just a weird thing, and it's almost like. And there's a couple other things too with the scare ships of 1909. It's the same thing in a way. People thought they were Zeppelins, but they would go 200, 250 miles an hour, and no Zeppelin could go that fast. Plus, in 1909, the Germans only had experimental Zeppelins, certainly none that could make it from Germany to England back. Mm-hmm. It was almost like, it's hard to put your finger on it, but it's almost like something was going on where people were seeing something that was just slightly out of time, slightly wrong. The Ghost rockets in 1946, same thing. People over those same parts of Sweden, and then finally over all of Scandinavia, people started seeing these rockets that were flying in formations, making turns, maneuvering. They thought they were leftover German buzz bombs from Peenemünde, which is in the eastern part of Germany, which is below Sweden, but they
Sure.
found out that that wasn't the case. And finally, a Swedish jet fighter got to ride right alongside one of these things, and the description that he gave is almost the exact description as you would describe a Tomahawk cruise missile these days. And even a Swedish defense minister who was in on it in the 40s, who gave an interview in the 80s, said, from everything I saw, someone was flying cruise missiles over Sweden in 1946, but who had cruise missiles?
Right, right.
Just another mystery, you know. Just something looks like something is just not right time-wise. So those just fascinated me. So
Right.
we were able to wrap those stories around the Foo Fighters, which is, you know, a whole kind of fascinating thing. And I think we don't get to Kenneth Arnold in the book until like 2/3 of the way. Into the
Sure,
book.
sure.
So yeah, to answer your question, you know, UFOs have been with us. It looks like all of human history. It really does. And there have been books written, UFOs in the Bible and so on. But we just thought, give them the flavor for that run-up chapter, and then let's just start with the scare ships of 1909 and go through the 20th century.
Right.
And that's what we did.
Yeah, definitely those 20, 30 years prior to World War II were really, really interesting reading. Again, the stuff with Korea and Vietnam, also very interesting, but I really have to touch on the Gulf War and anything sort of beyond that. This is where it's always a little bit risky to get into some of this material because I like to venture off into some of these topics that are not necessarily what you had put into some of the books that you touched on, but I'm sure you're aware of some of these stories. A lot of the stuff like the invasion of Iraq in 2003 being possibly more about stargates and things like that type of technology. Right. Where can you tie some of these stories together with the first Gulf War, a lot of the activity that's going on over the Middle East, and then you know, this second sort of incursion into that area?
Well, you know, as I was saying before, we originally had probably close to 200 stories that had potential to be in the book, and we picked about 70. There was about 4 or 5 stories that the only way I can describe them was that they were just too good not to put in. Okay, I mean, one of them, we have a story in there, but you know, the Red Baron might have shot down the UFO in World War I. We have a story in there that George Washington might have been in contact with aliens. You know?
Right.
You just can't leave stuff like that out. You know, you can't. So we came upon this story, and it was written up in Pravda, you know, which was the Russian news service. And what they were saying was that after the Gulf War and before the invasion of Iraq, there was this period, and this is now throughout the 90s and up to 2003, so 13 years, where the U.S. had a no-fly zone over Iraq. And it was just this kind of low-level war going on, where we would be flying over Iraq on a daily basis. Every once in a while, you would see in the paper that we had bombed one of their anti-aircraft sites. They had turned on their radars as if to shoot at us in very low-level conflicts. But always ongoing. And supposedly during that time, a UFO was, you know, spotted over Baghdad and supposedly was shot down. It was brought to Saddam Hussein's version of Area 51, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of it. And supposedly his engineers got 2 things out of it. Reverse engineered something they found in the flying saucer to make a weapon that was able to disable the space shuttle, the Challenger that went over and crashed, because it had on board the first and only Israeli shuttle pilot. And he had been one of the pilots that had bombed the Iraqi nuclear site in the early 80s. That's one story. The other story is that they were able to create some WMD from this reverse-engineered alien technology, and that's what the U.S. was looking for when they went in 2003. Now, you can make a good case that there was no nuclear or chemical or biological weapons in Iraq when the U.S. invaded, because the UN had been there for almost 15 years, combing that place, looking for this stuff, and even though Saddam Hussein led them on a wild goose chase, eventually they did get to all these places, and to have a nuclear program, a program to make nuclear weapons. Look what's going on in Iran now. I mean, there's no doubt that what they are doing, but they have like 2,000 centrifuges spinning
Right.
24 hours a day for like 3 or 4 years to get the amount of plutonium or whatever weapons grade uranium to make a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
You can't hide that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's as I say, just the proof is in the pudding, is that there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq. There were no chemical weapons or biological weapons, because once again you'd have to have just as big an infrastructure to create these things. You just can't create them in someone's basement. So there were those weapons weren't there, and the CIA had told the administration that, and the UN certainly had told the Bush administration that. So what were they going in for? So there's 2 ways you can think about it. They either went in on a falsehood, or they were looking for something. I mean, how crazy would it be that they were looking for WMD that came from a reverse engineered saucer? That would just turn the world upside down if that turned out to be true. But the story was out there, and as I said, it was just too good not to put in. It was a good way to end the book.
Right.
So that's how we ended the book, with that conjecture, that possibility, that theory.
Sure. Now, one of the things, actually, I'll jump to this right away. This is one of my favorite things. Was actually not just that chapter, but the one that followed, where you did sort of pull together a couple of thoughts. The final chapter you called The Grand Puzzle. So if you could explain first that title, and then I'd like to ask you about a couple of the quotes you have that are in here.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is a puzzle. I come upon this quote, and I use it in the book, and it's a great quote, is, UFOs exist, we just don't know what they are. They're here all the time. I mean, people seem to think, the general public seem to think that UFOs try to hide from us, okay? But they don't. There's 1,000 sightings around the world every month. Excuse me. 90% of them are can be explained, but that leaves 100 every month, month after month, that cannot be explained. So they're not hiding from us. They're around all the time. People see them all the time, and this has been going on for years. So you have to think, well, they're not hiding from us. They know, if there is a they know we know they are here. Okay, so what are they doing here? And it just seems like, and we hope that we brought this out in the book, it just seems like they are here watching us, especially when we go to war. And so why is that? And I really came to change my mind about, what I thought the origins of UFOs were, because, like a lot of people, I always thought it was the little green men from Mars theory. But I really think that there's a good possibility that they're time travelers. I think they're time travelers from our own future who are just coming back to see history as it's being made. Mm-hmm. Time tourists. If we had that opportunity now, there's a lot of people, sure, I would love to go back and see the Civil War. I'd like to go see the Battle of Troy. I asked someone the other day what they would like to do, and they said, I'd like to go see a Shakespeare play. Who wouldn't?
That's a great answer. Yeah, sure.
So I really believe that I really think that they are people. There's a good chance that people from our own future who have come back here to see history as it's being made, and there's something about wars that makes great history. And but that's just my theory. The puzzle is we know that they're here. We see them all the time. They're not hiding from us. Why can't we figure it out? Why can't we figure out what they are? Why doesn't somebody take the lead on doing a scientific study on what UFOs are? No one has ever really done it, because foolishly, back in 1948, it was turned over to the U.S. military. And they're the worst people to have been put in charge of this.
Well, let me actually touch on one of these quotes then, because this was really something that just hit home for me. This is actually from the book UFOs in Wartime, What They Didn't Want You to Know, by Mack Maloney. All these sightings can't be illusions, birds, airplanes, weather balloons, re-entry vehicles, or the planet Venus. All it takes is for one of them to be true, because then in a way they all become true, which makes perfect sense. But how do we get to the truth? The UFO enigma is so important it demands to be placed in the hands of objective, apolitical, purely scientific-minded people whose goal must be to simply tell us what we've been seeing all these years. It's exactly what you're saying. The Air Force, on the other hand, this was the thing that really jumped out at me. The Pentagon cheapened out, you say, when it came to studying UFOs. The institution that historically overspends on everything It's such a big example right there, almost an elephant in the room type of a thing. Chose to nickel and dime on this very important matter. Why? There's only one answer that you put in the book. They did it because they never intended to do a good job. Is there any other argument at this point? I mean, it seems that the experts, the UFO experts, are all sort of on the same page with that. What's it going to take to get everybody else to catch up?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think that putting it in their hands, and we go into the book a little bit too about in 1948, the Air Force actually turned over the study of UFOs to a section of the Air Force called the ATIC, the Aeronautical Technical Intelligence Center. And what these people did is they were in charge of determining how many nuclear bombs Russia had, whether Red China was going to get a nuclear bomb. So there were scientists, there were engineers. And they actually did a study for 6 months on UFOs, and they came back and reported to the Pentagon that UFOs existed, that they weren't delusions, that people actually saw things. And when they read that, there's the person who was in charge of the Air Force at the time, General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Vandenberg Air Force Base is now named after. He read it and he said, well, this isn't really the report we want. And I've never been in the military, but I know people who are in the military, and I know when a superior officer tells you that, what they say is, you might be right, but you're not. This isn't what we want. So they went back and they just phonied up a report. Yeah. And they said, no, people see UFOs, they're delusional, they're religious zealots or whatever. That was the time. That was the moment in 1948 and 49 when the ATIC, learned people, engineers, scientists, came forward and said, these things are real. And that's, if the Air Force had just gone the right direction, I think there's a good chance, and the right direction, I mean really put it to a good scientific study, we'd know a lot more about them than we do today. But that was the moment right there that they just decided to start covering it up. And it's a cover-up, I'm convinced, that lasts even today. Right. And how you change that, your original question, I don't know. How do you move the Pentagon?
I have a couple of the emails that we'd gone back and forth with, and we've touched on a bunch of these points already, but actually I'd like to get to one. I forgot I'd even said anything to you about this, but I was thinking about it when I was driving up here. And that is this, it's easy to launch into a whole big discussion about the media, honesty in the media, and whether they're covering or taking this thing seriously or not. But I had mentioned to you in one of these emails this now famous, it seems, interview, if you want to call it that, panel discussion that took place on Larry King's show with Stan Friedman as one of the many panel members, and the guy that they brought out to sort of be the skeptic in the room, Bill Nye, the science guy.
Bill Nye, yeah.
I mean,
of all people.
Of all people, and it seems like maybe even 10 years later, I don't remember exactly what year that piece was, we're no further along at all. We're still going to be treated that way when we bring up these questions and talk about it.
Right. See, that's the unusual thing, is that, out of the past 15 years, probably in the top 10 highest grossing movies, 3 or 4 of them are UFO movies.
Absolutely.
All the Men in Black, Independence Day, War of the Worlds. People are interested in this, okay? But the mainstream media, for whatever reason, still looks at it as, you'll see lots of UFO reports on Halloween, on April Fool's Day. That's the way they treat it.
Yeah.
My thought is that I think, and maybe that's just the way it is, and if you think it's hard to turn over the Pentagon, imagine turning over the networks. But I would almost be willing to bet that someone could go to a local news channel, here we're close to Baltimore and Boston, wherever, and make a case that they would be a science, let's say this, not fringe science, but like a extra science reporter, and report every day, just as they have health reports on every day. Mm-hmm. Report every day on unusual science, with an emphasis on UFOs. UFOs were seen down over Brazil today. They did this, this, and this. UFOs were seen over France today. They did this, this, and this. People saw UFOs going into the ocean off the Bahamas today. If you continuously reported these things as they should be, as real news events, I think eventually people will go, "Wow, look at what's going on."
Right. How can there be this many?
How could there be this many? Right. How could they be? And there is this many. but why they don't do that, I don't know, because it seems like people are interested in UFOs, UFO hunters, great big show,
Sure.
Ancient Aliens, big show,
Yeah, right.
the movies, the books, but the mainstream media, they just, I don't know, they're out to lunch when it comes to this, and I think they would, just for purely mercenary reasons. I think if you're in a market that had 6 or 7 local news channels, like in Boston, if one of them had reports like this on a regular basis, I'm telling you, I think you would pick up viewers.
Right.
I think you would, and if you did it in a serious-minded way, I think people would love it.
Just out of curiosity, have you met Susan Swiatek before?
No,
She's the Virginia State Director for MUFON, and then her husband Rob works down at the patent office. He's also involved in MUFON and UFORC and a couple of these others. I've spoken to both of them a couple times. Rob makes an incredibly interesting argument. He said in an interview a couple of years ago something about living in an area like this major metropolitan area, that if you do the percentages, and we'll just throw it out for the sake of discussion, 2%, let's say, of the population at large has been actually abducted by a UFO, right? He's wondering where all the sightings are in a metropolitan area like this. What's going on with this phenomenon? Because you walk down the street and there's apartment buildings with 10,000 people in them.
Right.
Just the math alone tells you that about a half dozen of those people have been abducted, possibly right out of that building.
Very strange. Yeah,
So,
when you run the numbers, it is unusual.
it's really very, very strange, of course. So, again, I'll tell you what, I was thinking maybe we should take a quick break because I had a whole sort of bunch of other stuff. But I definitely wanted to talk about the book, and I thought it was a fantastic read, UFOs in Wartime. Author Mack Maloney is talking to us. We're going to take a quick break here and come back and talk about the conference tomorrow I wanted to ask you about, and a few other things on comments I'd asked you for last week on Gary McKinnon and some other stuff.
All right, sure.
That's great. Timeandspace.us. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes.